If you want to
No
speak
problem.
a little bit more, feel free.
They'll be
Usually,
they'll be tired of me after 40.
yeah. No, I don't think that's the case. Anyway, it's not forecast to have questions. The format is a solo lecture. Eventually, if you provoke too much, my if you provoke me too much, I'm going to ask a question.
Sure. That'd be great.
Okay, so we're just going to open. I'm going to introduce you in English because there are two YouTube broadcasts, one in Portuguese and one in English. And again, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for the invitation. It's an honor.
Pessoal, a gente já tá online no YouTube, tá? Só pro pessoal. Não estamos ao vivo ainda, desculpa, mas pro pessoal aqui.
Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leonardo Avritzer, and on behalf of ANPOCS, it is my pleasure to host this activity. That's a lecture by Professor Steven Levitsky. I'm going to shortly introduce Professor Levitsky. Professor Levitsky has a PhD in political science at the University of California at Berkeley, and he's a professor of government at Harvard University. He has published a lot, and I'm going only to mention the most important recent works. In 2010, Professor Levitsky published, together with Luke and Way, Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War. In 2018, he published, together with Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. How Democracy is a New York Times bestseller. It was on the bestseller week, on bestseller list for a few weeks. Professor Levitsky also most recently published, again with Daniel Ziblatt, Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. Stephen, it is my pleasure to introduce you. It's our pleasure at ANPOCS to have you with us. You are very welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be invited. I've been a big fan of the work of Professor Avritzer for many years. My talk today is mostly going to draw on our most recent book that Leo just mentioned, Tyranny of the Minority. Although I'm going to try to, I'm not an expert on Brazil, but try to draw some comparisons and contrasts to the Brazilian case, which has had some interesting parallels to the US in recent years. So the United States is experiencing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. All of the leading global democracy indexes register a decline for the United States since 2016. Just to give one example, Freedom House as a global freedom index, which scores every country in the world from a low of 0 to a high of 100 every year. One decade ago, in 2014, the United States received a score of 92 out of 100, which put it on par with Japan and the UK and Canada. Today, the United States score is 83, which is still a democracy, but it is tied with Romania, and it is below Argentina. That is shocking news to many Americans. But when you have widespread efforts to restrict access to the vote, when you have violent threats against election workers, against elected officials, against prosecutors, against judges, and of course, when you have an attempt by an incumbent president to violently overturn the results of an election, you fall to the point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina, because those things don't happen in Argentina. So why is this happening? Why is US democracy seemingly going off the rails? In Tyranny of the Minority, Daniel Ziblatt and I argue that the United States is undergoing an unprecedented transition, a transition to a truly multiracial democracy in which a majority and once dominant ethnic group loses its dominant status. I don't think any other democratic society in modern history has undergone a transition like that. That transition, that transformation, has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a minority of Americans. But that's only part of the story. The US Constitution is exacerbating the problem by empowering that authoritarian minority. So I'm going to take each of these points in turn. Okay, the principle, the most imminent threat facing US democracy is simply that one of its two major parties has abandoned its commitment to democratic rules of the game. Political parties or politicians who are committed to democracy, what the great Spanish political scientist Juan Linz called loyal Democrats, they must do three things. So parties that are committed to democracy must always do three things. They must always accept the results of elections, win or lose. They must always unambiguously renounce political violence, and they must break all ties. They must break completely with violent or anti-democratic forces. These first two principles, accepting election results and renouncing violence, are pretty straightforward. But I want to spend a couple of minutes on this third point, breaking with anti-democratic forces. Individual leaders, as Linz knew very well, cannot kill a democracy on their own. They always need accomplices among mainstream politicians. These are what Linz called semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats are sometimes hard to distinguish in a crowd. They look and they talk and they dress and they act like everyday politicians, but they differ in how they respond to authoritarian threats. And they differ in particular in how they respond to authoritarian threats in their own camp, on their own political ideological side. When authoritarian threats emerge on their own flank, on their own side, loyal Democrats, politicians who are committed to democracy, do three things. They publicly condemn anti-democratic behavior, even if it's done by their own allies. They expel anti-democratic extremists from their own ranks. They refuse to nominate them. They refuse to support their candidacies. And they're willing to join forces with pro-democratic rivals from across the political spectrum in order to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremists. Semi-loyal Democrats do none of these things. Rather than repudiate anti-democratic behavior on their own flank, they will downplay it, they will justify or condone it, or in many cases, they'll just simply remain silent. They have no comment. Rather than isolating or expelling anti-democratic extremists, semi-loyalists will tolerate, they will accommodate, even protect them. And crucially, semi-loyalists refuse to work with ideological rivals to defeat anti-democratic extremists, even when democracy is on the line. Now, semi-loyalists they're not trying to kill democracy. These are not openly authoritarian figures. They're just ordinary politicians trying to get ahead, trying to succeed in their careers. But semi-loyalists are crucial enablers of authoritarianism. Because when mainstream politicians, when mainstream political parties tolerate or condone anti-democratic extremists, it normalizes them. It leads the media to start to cover them and treat them like ordinary politicians. Donors who once shunned them will think now it's okay to contribute money to them. Leading pollsters and consultants will start returning their phone calls. And of course, voters will take them more seriously. One of the clear lessons from democratic breakdowns in Europe in the 1930s and from South America in the 1960s and 70s is that when mainstream political parties of the center left or the center right begin to tolerate, to accommodate, to flirt with violent extremists, that's when democracies get into trouble. Since 2020, the Republican Party in the United States has violated all three of Linz's basic principles of democratic behavior. Not only was Trump the first president in the history of the United States to refuse to accept defeat and to try to overturn an election, but crucially, the vast bulk of the Republican Party accompanied him, went along with him. Some journalists evaluated the public statements of all 261 Republican members of Congress, the House and the Senate, to see whether their public statements after the 2020 election cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election. 86% of Republican legislators made statements that cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election. 86%. Republican politicians have also begun to flirt with political violence. During the 2022 legislative election campaign, the New York Times found more than 100 Republican television ads in which candidates openly brandished or fired semi-automatic weapons, machine guns. I can think of no other political party in any established democracy in which so many candidates so openly embrace violence. But maybe the most dangerous feature of the contemporary Republican Party is its refusal now to break with openly anti-democratic forces. Republican leaders knew that Donald Trump, and still know, that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. Republican leaders, many of them, were privately troubled, worried about Trump's anti-democratic behavior in the aftermath of the election. But despite that, they enabled it anyway. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him in the Senate. They blocked the creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection. And they are now nearly unanimous in supporting Trump for the presidency, despite the fact that he attempted to overturn an election and block a peaceful transfer of power. So why the hell is this happening? Why would a mainstream conservative party that's been competing in elections peacefully for 150 years suddenly turn away from democracy? In our book, we argue that it is a fear of losing. For democracy to work, political parties have to be able to tolerate losing. They have to be able to live with losing. Nobody likes to lose. But if we lose elections, we have to be able to get up, go home, maybe get drunk, and get up the next day and play the democratic game again. When political parties or their constituents, their supporters, perceive losing to pose an existential threat, to be something that is life or death, they tend to radicalize. and they often turn against democracy. You see this in the United States with the Southern Democrats, the Democratic Party in the U.S. South after the Civil War. Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War in the United States, brought the United States' first experiment with multiracial democracy. It was a short-lived experiment. But Reconstruction in 1867, 1868 brought widespread Black enfranchisement. Black men were immediately registered en masse to vote. African Americans were a majority or a near majority in every state in the U.S. South. So Black enfranchisement was a dramatic change in politics. Not only did Black suffrage threaten the Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, it threatened to overturn the entire racial order in the South. For many Southern whites, that felt like an existential threat. So the Democrats, the representatives of Southern whites in the South, abandoned any pretense of democracy. As one North Carolina Democratic politician put it, and I quote, "We cannot outnumber the Negroes, and so we must either out-cheat, out-count, or outshoot them." And that is exactly what they did. Unwilling to lose, Southern Democrats used a combination of violent terrorism and election fraud to seize power throughout the South. They then used poll taxes, literacy tests, and a bunch of other measures to effectively wipe out African American voting rights, ushering in 80 years of authoritarian rule in the U.S. South. We fear that something similar is happening to the Republican Party today in the United States. And the roots of this phenomena, the roots of this transformation, lie in the civil rights reforms of the 1960s, the United States' second experiment with multiracial democracy. The Civil Rights Revolution, 1950s, 60s, 70s, generated a lot of resentment among white voters, especially in the U.S. South, which at the time was overwhelmingly belonged to the Democratic Party. So white voters in the South were Democrats. The Republicans were a minority party in the 1960s, but white resentment over civil rights gave them an opportunity to expand their base. So beginning with Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, continuing with Richard Nixon, continuing with Ronald Reagan, the Republicans spent about 20 years explicitly targeting racially conservative white and white Christian voters. And that strategy succeeded. In a span of about 40 years, Southern whites flipped from being overwhelmingly Democrats to being overwhelmingly Republicans. The Republican Party established itself in the United States as the party of white Christians. They won the white vote in every election since 1968 without exception. And because the United States electorate was still overwhelmingly white and Christian in the 1970s, the 1980s, even the 1990s, the Republicans became America's majority party. The Republican Party won every single presidential election between 1968 and 1988, except the 1976 Watergate election. That's a pretty good run for 20 years. But the strategy eventually ran into trouble because at the same time that the Republicans were becoming America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and less Christian. The percentage of Americans who identified as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. That change posed two threats to Republicans. The first was electoral. It became increasingly difficult for an overwhelmingly white Christian party to win national majorities in the 21st century, which is why the Republicans have only won the popular vote for president once in Taylor Swift's entire lifetime, once since 1988. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote, and he translated that into a landslide 44-state victory over Jimmy Carter. 32 years later, 2012, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote, but he still lost the election. when Republican leaders realized that they were winning the white vote, but losing the American vote, they started to panic. But the problem went well beyond just losing elections. For much of the Republican base, the Republican rank and file, the United States' transition to multiracial democracy felt like an existential threat, because white Christians are not just any group in our society. For 200 plus years, for 2 centuries, they occupied the top position in every one of the United States' political, economic, cultural, social hierarchies. They were the politicians. They were the judges. They were the CEOs. They were the university presidents. They were the football coaches. They were the newspaper editors. They were the TV experts. All the way through my bar mitzvah in the early 1980s, all the way through the early 1980s, every single president, every single vice president, every single Speaker of the House, every single Senate Majority Leader, every single Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, every single governor, every single Fortune 500 CEO, every single Miss America, all of them were white without exception. All of that is now ending. It's ending rapidly. It's ending relentlessly. It's ending right before our eyes. The number of Black and Latino members of Congress has quadrupled from 28 in 1980 to 114 today. For the first time in American history, the percentage of African Americans in Congress is now equal to the percentage of African Americans in the population. African Americans are not underrepresented in Congress for the first time ever. In 1965, all 9 Supreme Court justices were white men. Today, 4 of 9 are white men. Only 6 of 9 are white. And the change extends way beyond politics. We see it in the growing presence of non-white and multiracial families on our TV and movie screen. We see it in mounting and significant societal pushback against acts of racism. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement, the largest wave of protests in the history of the United States. We see it in challenges in newsrooms and in classrooms to historical narratives that downplay or ignore America's racist past. We are witnessing in the United States, we are living through an unprecedented assault on this country's racial hierarchies. But when your group has been at the top of that racial hierarchy for 250 years, challenges to a hierarchy can feel threatening. Losing one's dominant social status can feel like an existential threat. And many Trump voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. They feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that sense of loss has radicalized many rank and file Republicans. In a poll done 3 years ago, 56% of Republicans agreed with the statement, and I quote, that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to stop it. 56%. Now, the Republicans' radicalization would pose less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies, where electoral majorities generally govern. MAGA and Trump have never, not for one day, represented a majority of Americans. Trump has never had an approval rating of more than 50%. In fact, for the first time in our history, I think it's fair to say that a consistent majority of Americans embrace the core principles of multiracial democracy, diversity, and racial equality. A strong majority of Americans supported the Black Lives Matter movement. More than 60% of Americans consistently agree with the statement that the growing diversity of our society makes America a better place to live. And a recent poll a couple of years ago found that more than 60% of Americans believe that our public schools should teach our kids about America's history of racism, even if it makes kids uncomfortable. For the first time ever, the United States has a multiracial Democratic majority. But that multiracial Democratic majority has hurled itself against some of the world's most powerful counter-majoritarian institutions. Let me be very clear here. Little political science. Counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. Modern democracy requires the protection of certain minority rights. Not everything should be up for grabs in elections. As former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson put it, some domains must be placed beyond the reach of majorities. Daniel and I argue that two domains in particular, two specific domains, must remain beyond the reach of majorities. The first is basic civil rights and civil liberties. Civil rights like the right to vote, free speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, of assembly, of protest, must be protected from the whims of any electoral or legislative majority. Pretty straightforward. Secondly, second domain that has to be beyond the reach of majorities is the democratic process itself. Elected governments cannot be able to use popular majorities, parliamentary majorities, to entrench themselves in power. For example, by changing the rules, by passing laws that weaken opponents or that undermine fair competition. That's the kind of tyranny of the majority that we saw, for example, in Chavez's Venezuela and in Orban's Hungary. So we need mechanisms to protect the democratic system from majorities that would subvert it. So civil liberties on the one hand and the right to fair competition on the other hand are essential minority rights. That's why we need constitutional protection of civil liberties. That's why we need independent judiciaries that have some constitutional review power. That's why we need relatively high barriers to constitutional reforms. It shouldn't be that you can change the constitutional rules of the game with 51% of parliament. But not all counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. Remember, democracies are supposed to empower majorities. So just as some domains have to be placed beyond the reach of majorities, other domains have to remain within the reach of majorities. And in the United States, at least, we tend to forget this. Two domains in particular. One domain that must be within the reach of majorities always is elections. Those who win more votes should prevail over those with fewer votes in determining who holds political office. There's no theory of democracy that I know of that justifies any other outcome. The second domain that should remain within the reach of majorities is legislation. Those who win elections should govern. Partisan minorities should not be able to permanently veto regular legislation backed by legislative majorities, provided that the legislation doesn't violate basic rights. So institutions that prevent electoral majorities from winning or that prevent electoral majorities from governing are not essential to democracy. In fact, they're arguably antithetical to democracy. The reason I say this is that the United States has an unusual number of these undemocratic counter-majoritarian institutions. The Electoral College, which allows the loser of the popular vote to win the presidency. A severely malapportioned Senate, which provides equal representation to all states regardless of those states' population. The Senate filibuster, which allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by a majority. And a powerful Supreme Court with lifetime tenure for justices, which allows justices appointed in one generation to thwart majorities for generations to come. Excessive counter-majoritarianism, I want to suggest, now threatens U.S. democracy. Concessions that were made to small states in 1787 built a bias into our political system. It overrepresented sparsely populated territories. So the Electoral College favors sparsely populated states. The U.S. Senate heavily favors sparsely populated states. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is also biased towards sparsely populated states. That rural bias has always existed. It's always been unfair and undemocratic. But it's never it seriously advantaged one party over the other party because for the first 200 years of US history, both major parties had urban wings and rural wings. It is only in the 21st century, it's only today, that US parties have split along urban-rural lines. Today, the Democrats are overwhelmingly the party of big cities, and the the Republicans are the party of small towns and rural areas. That gives the Republicans, through no fault of their own, it gives the Republicans a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and in the Supreme Court. And it allows them to win, to hold, and to wield national power without winning national majorities. That is a problem. A little bit of data, which is pretty well known. Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency once since 1988, yet they've controlled the presidency for most of the 21st century. A popular majority was not enough for Joe Biden to win the presidency. He had to win the popular vote by at least 4 points. Had he won by the margin by which Lula defeated Bolsonaro, Trump, in 2022, Trump would have been reelected. Kamala Harris faces the same problem today. If you look at polls today, Kamala Harris is projected to win the popular vote. She has a very good chance to win the popular vote. Donald Trump today is the favorite to win the presidency. The Senate's even more skewed. Senators are elected to staggered 6-year terms. 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. That means it takes 3 elections over 6 years to fully renovate the U.S. Senate. The Democratic Party has won the overall popular vote in every 6-year cycle in the 21st century. Every 6-year cycle since 2000. And yet the Republicans have controlled the Senate for half of this century. In recent years, the Democrats have needed to win the popular vote for the Senate by about 5 points in order to retain control of the Senate. So even if the Democrats consistently win 51, 52% of the popular vote for Senate, the Republicans will control the Senate. Composition of the Supreme Court is even more skewed. 4 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices were approved, confirmed by senators who represented less than half the U.S. population. 3 of them, 3 of our Supreme Court justices were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. This is minority rule. Our institutions increasingly allow those who win fewer votes to govern over those who win more votes. Think about a concrete example. In 2016, the loser of the popular vote won the presidency, and the party that lost the popular vote for the Senate won control of the Senate. That president and that Senate went on to fill 3 Supreme Court seats, pushing the court dramatically to the right for at least a generation. If electoral majorities, if simple electoral majorities determined who won the presidency and who controlled the Senate, like in other democracies, the U.S. Supreme Court today would have a 6-3 liberal majority rather than a 6-3 conservative majority. I want to suggest that minority rule is a uniquely American problem. In no other established democracy, to my knowledge, can partisan minorities thwart electoral majorities as consistently or as consequentially as in the United States. Why is that the case? Back in the 19th century, Europe, Latin America had all sorts of undemocratic institutions. They had monarchies with veto power. They had unelected legislative chambers. They had electoral colleges. They had all sorts of filibuster-like mechanisms through which parliamentary minorities thwarted majorities. But over the course of the last century, over the course of the last roughly 120 years, other democracies gradually shed their pre-democratic institutions. Britain weakened its House of Lords, stripping it of veto power. Denmark, Sweden, Portugal, New Zealand got rid of their undemocratic upper chambers. Germany, Austria, Belgium democratized their senates by making them more proportional to the population. Britain, Canada, France, other democracies established cloture rules that allowed simple majorities to end parliamentary debate, thereby eliminating the the kind of filibuster we see in the United States. All other established democracies establish either term limits or retirement ages for Supreme Court justices, and every other presidential democracy on earth got rid of its electoral college. Argentina was the last one in 1994. So other democracies across the world have become more democratic over time. They have eliminated, or at least watered down, 18th and 19th century institutions that allowed minorities to systematically thwart majority. Only the United States has retained most of its pre-democratic institutions. So today, the United States, again, is the only presidential democracy in the world with an electoral college. We have the most malapportioned Senate in the world, except, I think, for Argentina and Brazil. No other democracy allows a congressional minority to routinely veto regular legislation backed by a majority. And the United States, again, is the only established democracy with truly lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. Every other established democracy has either term limits or a retirement age. So we argue in the book that it is urgent that we democratize U.S. democracy. And in the book, Ziblatt and I propose 15 reforms that would help to ensure that electoral majorities win power and govern in the United States. I won't go through those reforms. In the meantime, we, of course, face a much more imminent authoritarian threat. Donald Trump has been very clear this time around about what he plans to do if he wins power next month. He tells us he will use the Justice Department to investigate and prosecute his rivals. He tells us he wants to jail election officials and rescind the licenses of major media critics. He tells us he will use the army under the Insurrection Act to repress protests. And he tells us that he will order the deportation of 15 to 20 million individuals. So the question is, and I want to end with this, how can a democracy protect itself from this kind of a threat from within? How does it protect itself from an electoral authoritarian threat? In a piece that's going to come out on next Sunday in the New York Times, Daniel and I identify 5 different strategies that democracies have used to defend themselves against threats from within. Americans, we argue, have historically embraced a liberal approach in which all perspectives, all parties are allowed and encouraged to compete freely. The idea is that electoral competition works like a market. And if all ideas are openly debated, if all ideas compete freely, then good ideas will eventually prevail over bad ideas. History suggests that such an approach is pretty naive. The good guys do not always prevail in elections. Chavez, Orban, Bukele, Bolsonaro all won majorities in free elections. For that reason, as you all know, many democracies take a much more muscular approach. They empower state authorities to ban candidates or parties that threaten democracy or that threaten the rule of law. This is what is commonly known as a militant democracy approach. This approach was first developed in post-war Germany, understandably, but it quickly spread across Europe and across Latin America in the aftermath of World War II, including to Brazil. So Brazil's Supreme Court, as you know, has vast authority to bar politicians from running for office, can do so for corruption, for vote buying, and since 2021 in particular, for attacking democracy. And last year, the court used that authority, somewhat controversial in Brazil, to bar Bolsonaro from holding public office for 8 years. Think of the contrast to the United States. Trump and Bolsonaro were both pretty similar far-right populists who governed pretty badly, who narrowly lost their re-election bids, and who tried to illegally overturn the results of elections. Both of them tried and failed to carry out presidential coups. But whereas Trump is running for office again with a good chance to win the presidency in 3 weeks, Bolsonaro is banned from politics, is on the political sidelines. Now, the United States has an element of militant democracy in its constitution. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution bars office holders who participated in an insurrection from ever seeking office again. But efforts to use the 14th Amendment to bar Trump from running were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court also intervened to stall efforts to prosecute Trump for his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And it recently ruled that presidents have broad immunity as long as they are engaging in official acts as president. So the U.S. judiciary has completely failed to hold Trump accountable for his assault on democracy. Now, if state institutions will not protect us from authoritarians, the next best alternative may be political parties. And this is what Daniel and I call partisan self-policing. Mainstream party leaders have to weed out extremists in their own ranks. They have to be willing to publicly denounce them, expel them, reject them as candidates for higher office. I was very critical of the Brazilian right for backing Bolsonaro in the second round, center right and right, for backing Bolsonaro in 2018. But I think right-wing politicians did a reasonable job of self-policing after Bolsonaro got elected. So in 2021, many conservatives backed a law in Congress that made it a crime to attack democratic institutions. That law may eventually land Bolsonaro in prison. In 2022, all major right-wing politicians in Brazil recognized Lula's victory immediately on election night. Right-wing politicians also forcefully denounced the January 8th attacks and pushed, in fact, for a congressional investigation. In the United States, by contrast, right-wing politicians have consistently defended Trump. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection. And when Congress impeached Trump after January 6th, and when the Senate voted on conviction, which would have barred Trump from running for election, Republican senators opted to acquit him. Even today, when Trump has been indicted for trying to overturn an election, Republican leaders continue to back him. So the Republican Party will not protect us from Trump. That's clear. That leaves a fourth strategy, the formation of a broad multi-party coalition to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremists. When faced with an authoritarian threat, it is crucial that pro-democratic parties set aside their ideological differences, set aside their partisan differences, and join forces in defense of democracy. We saw this strategy in Belgium and in Finland in the 1930s, where left and center-right parties joined forces to defeat fascist movements. We saw it last year in Poland, when parties of the left, the center, and the center-right joined forces to defeat the Liberal Law and Justice Party. And we've seen it multiple times in France, where left, center, and center-right parties have united to form what they call a cordon sanitaire to keep the far right out of power. We saw that as recently as this summer. Brazilian Democrats failed to build a broad coalition against Bolsonaro in 2018, but they did it pretty effectively, at least in the second round in 2022. In the United States, a small handful of Republicans have embraced this coalitional strategy. Congresswoman Liz Cheney's cooperation with Democrats in the House January 6th Commission is an example. Cheney, who has endorsed Democratic candidate Kamala Harris, has made it clear that Trump's threat to democracy outweighs any of her partisan loyalties and any policy preferences. But containment is really difficult in a two-party system, and very few Republicans have followed Cheney and endorsed Kamala Harris this year. So we are very unlikely to see an American cordon sanitaire. It's a regular partisan election, red versus blue, Republicans versus Democrats. Okay, so if neither the state nor political parties will act to defend democracy, that leaves really only civil society, which means that business leaders, unions, religious leaders, public intellectuals, celebrities must step up and take a high-profile stance in defense of democracy, must draw a line for all the public to see that demonstrates where politicians should not go, should not cross. Danny and I call this a strategy of societal mobilization. We saw this kind of behavior earlier this year in Germany, where the far-right AfD was linked to neo-Nazi plans to organize a mass deportation of immigrants. When news of that meeting and those plans were released to the public, the societal response in Germany was pretty extraordinary. Top business leaders, together with top labor leaders and Catholic leaders, Catholic bishops, all publicly, forcefully denounced the AfD as anti-democratic. One leading bishop declared, and I quote, "Anyone wishing to deport other people denies their human dignity. The AfD has abandoned democratic principles and cannot be voted for by Catholics." There were also massive citizen demonstrations. For 7 weeks, more than 2 million Germans marched in repudiation of the AfD. We saw an even larger societal mobilization in Israel last year in response to the Netanyahu government's judicial coup. There were 10 months of protest that mobilized hundreds of thousands of people. Israel's top business association, the Israel Business Forum, joined the protest. Unions organized a general strike. Universities shut down. Thousands of artists, intellectuals, retired generals spoke out publicly, forcefully. We saw some, a little less, but some societal mobilization here in Brazil under Bolsonaro. In 2021, in August, 107 civil society organizations published a letter in defense of democracy, which stated a broad commitment to free elections and the rule of law. That letter was signed by Fiesp, the leading industrial association in Sao Paulo, top labor confederations, Catholic officials, human rights groups, and all the leading law school and university faculties. That's how you defend democracy. U.S. civil society, I want to suggest, has not responded in a similar way. Most business leaders in the United States have remained on the sidelines. Associations like the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, have remained silent, have not taken a public position. After January 6th, after the 2021 insurrection, many business leaders made a public pledge not to give money to congresspeople who denied the results of the election. Most of them subsequently reneged on that commitment. They're still funding congresspeople who deny the results of the election. Same thing with religious figures. U.S. bishops have not spoken out publicly like their German counterparts, even though Trump has also embraced mass deportation. Societies, it seems, are more likely to respond quickly and forcefully to authoritarian threats when they have experienced losing democracy. Germans and Brazilians have memories of past authoritarianism. Americans, most Americans, do not. To sum up and to finish, there are 4 ways to actively defend a democracy from electoral threats from within. The most muscular strategy is to empower the state to ban anti-democratic forces, as Brazilians did with Bolsonaro. If you do not use the state, you have to rely on political elites, either through self-policing or through the forging of broad coalitions like we saw in Poland and in France. If political elites fail to act, societal actors must step up and mobilize, like we saw in Germany, like we saw in Israel, like we saw to some degree in Brazil. Americans, unfortunately, are pursuing none of these strategies. Instead, we have left things in the hands of the electoral market. And history suggests that that may not be enough. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much for your wonderful, though not very optimistic lecture. This lecture, opening lecture at ANPOCS, usually does not carry with it a question, but I would break with the tradition and ask you a question, if you allow me. I think that I agree with most of your interpretation about Brazil, but I think Brazil is more a case of multiple arenas contestation of Bolsonarism. Congress contested Bolsonaro, but only to a certain degree. If Bolsonaro would have been re-elected, there would be no contestation, despite any attempt on democracy. The Supreme Court, I think, is more democratic in Brazil for several reasons, because it has more empowerment capacity to contain the executive and other branches than, in my view, the US Supreme Court. And civil society, as you mentioned, also played an important role. But I would argue that none of them could have done the job. So we need multiple arenas actions in order to contain an authoritarian or autocratic power holder. So how would you react to this? And if this is easier in the US, then since the US does not have the experience of democracy, of authoritarianism, and I agree with you, would this be a feasible strategy?
The use of multiple arenas?
Yes.
I mean, I think your characterization is absolutely right. I'm obviously not an expert in Brazil, but you did see action in Brazil, very important action by the Supreme Court, action by Congress, and action by civil society. So in at least 3 arenas, behavior. It is entirely possible that if you take away 1 or 2 of those arenas, you get a different outcome. My concern in the United States, I think it's a pretty parallel situation. The United States may, in fact, have some more things going for it in terms of defending democracy than Brazil. Its institutions are older, some of them are more entrenched. There's a lot of money and power in the opposition, but we're acting in none of those arenas. So even if we saw in the United States a clear intervention by the judiciary or a active mobilization by civil society, we might have a chance. But in none of the arenas that you point to in Brazil do we see sufficient defense of democracy, and that's what concerns me. We've left it all in the hands of voters, and as I mentioned earlier, even the electoral marketplace is tilted in favor of Trump. Voters did not elect Donald Trump in 2016. They elected Hillary Clinton. The Electoral College gave us Clinton. And probably if Trump wins in 2024, it'll be because of the Electoral College and not the popular vote.
Okay, so not going to go on because I know you're a very busy person, and our schedule is a 1-hour lecture. So thank you very much for being with us. We really enjoyed your participation at ANPOCS, and we hope you'll be open for future invitations of ANPOCS and Brazilian political science to come here and work with us on democratic strategies. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's really an honor, and I'm working on my Portuguese so I can go and visit in person.
Okay, thank you very much.
Take care.
Recording stopped.